What if the chronicle of civilization did not originate on our own planet? Suppose that long before the earliest city emerged in Mesopotamia, a neighboring world had already experienced its own ascent and decline. A world now enshrouded in clouds, with heat sufficient to liquefy lead. What if Venus was once the cradle of civilizations before Earth was even prepared for life? When I gaze at the nocturnal sky, Venus frequently stands out as the most luminous body aside from the moon. To the unaided eye, it gleams like a steadfast beacon, unwavering and almost too brilliant to be counted among the stars. Ancient civilizations referred to it as the morning star or the evening star due to its proximity to the sun. For thousands of years, humanity presumed Venus was a world not so different from our own. To early astronomers, it appeared logical to believe that beneath its cloud cover lay oceans, forests, and possibly even life. It was not until the last century, with the advent of space probes and radar mapping, that this vision of Venus was supplanted by a reality far more bizarre and inhospitable. Today, I know Venus as a planet of radical conditions. The temperature on its surface is adequate to melt lead. The atmosphere is dense, pressing down with a force more than 90 times greater than what I experience at sea level on Earth. The clouds, which appear so luminous and reflective from a distance, are composed not of water vapor, but of sulfuric acid. And the winds in the upper atmosphere encircle the planet at velocities that would obliterate nearly anything I could construct. For me, Venus is the very definition of an uninhabitable world, a location where no human could last for even a moment without protection. The Soviet Union dispatched multiple probes to Venus during the 1970s and 1980s. A select few succeeded in landing on the surface and sending back photographs before they were obliterated. These pictures, though grainy and fleeting, revealed a terrain of desolate rocks, yellow skies, and a quietude interrupted only by oppressive heat. The longest duration any of those probes survived was just over 2 hours before their electronics gave out. Venus, it appeared, was not only uninhabitable in the present, but had always been hostile to life. This was the determination most scientists came to following those missions. And still, Venus is nearly the same size as Earth. Its gravity is almost identical. Its placement in the solar system situates it near enough to the Sun that it gets a comparable amount of energy. In numerous respects, it seems to be Earth's twin, a parallel world that took shape under almost the same circumstances. This is what makes its state so peculiar. How could two planets so alike in size and position end up so divergent? Why is one cloaked in blue oceans and green continents while the other is enveloped in toxic clouds and intolerable heat? These inquiries have prompted some researchers to view Venus differently. Instead of questioning why it is hostile to life, they started to question whether it had perpetually been this way. What if Venus, long before it transformed into the world I observe today, once possessed oceans? What if its clouds were less dense, its surface cooler, its atmosphere less oppressive? Over the last few decades, evidence has gradually accumulated suggesting that Venus may have appeared quite different in its remote past. Computer simulations indicate it could have sustained liquid water for hundreds of millions of years, or perhaps even more. If this holds true, then the narrative of Venus is completely altered. It is no longer merely Earth's unsuccessful counterpart. It becomes a planet with a history, one that may have progressed through stages similar to our own. And if water once existed, life might have as well. For some, this is the point where the imagination ventures further. If life emerged on Venus before it did on Earth, could it have had a greater span of time to evolve? Could Venus, prior to Earth, have been the first residence of complex organisms, perhaps even civilizations? When I compare Venus to Earth, the resemblances are difficult to disregard. Both planets are almost identical in size, with Venus being just marginally smaller. Their mass and density are nearly the same, which implies they are constructed from the same type of rocky substance. They both orbit in what astronomers term the inner solar system, close enough to the Sun to receive warmth, yet not so close as to be utterly seared. If I were to envision a planet capable of supporting life, Venus would seem to be one of the most probable candidates, at least in theory. From a distance, Venus even has a deceptively serene appearance. The layer of clouds that envelops the planet reflects sunlight so efficiently that it conceals the violent reality beneath. To early astronomers using telescopes, this cloud cover appeared as a veil of mystery, a potential indicator of a moist and fertile world. Some scientists in the 19th and early 20th centuries even theorized about jungles or marshes hidden below, believing perhaps that Venus was a younger iteration of Earth, a place still characterized by heat and humidity. The notion that it could be a reflection of our own world was not implausible. But as technology progressed, the reality started to surface. Radar mapping, first conducted in the mid-20th century, showed that the surface of Venus was not covered in oceans or forests, but in mountains, plains, and expansive volcanic fields. Later, spacecraft dispatched by the United States and the Soviet Union verified that the clouds were composed of acid and that the surface was far hotter than anyone had anticipated. What had appeared to be a twin to Earth was, in fact, an entirely different sort of world. The discrepancy between Earth and Venus has perplexed scientists for decades. If two planets originated with nearly the same initial conditions, why did one evolve into a cradle for life, while the other became an inferno? The distinction may rest in their proximity to the Sun. Venus is approximately 30% closer than Earth, and that minor difference means it receives almost double the amount of solar energy. Over eons, this may have triggered a runaway effect where water evaporated more rapidly, thickening the atmosphere and trapping additional heat. The cycle reinforced itself until the planet arrived at the state I see today. But herein lies the enigma. If the runaway greenhouse effect occurred swiftly, then Venus may have never been conducive to life. Yet, if it took hundreds of millions of years to reach its present condition, there could have been an extended period when Venus was stable, with oceans on its surface and temperatures not so different from Earth's. Models of planetary climates indicate both scenarios are plausible, and I may never know for certain which trajectory Venus took. This ambiguity creates an opportunity for speculation. If Venus once had oceans, then it was more than just Earth's twin. It might have been Earth's elder sibling, experiencing habitable conditions first. Water, warmth, and geological activity could have merged to form an environment where life had an opportunity to begin. And if life started there earlier, it would not be illogical to think that it could have had more time to develop complexity before Earth even emerged from its nascent stages. So when I refer to Venus as Earth's twin, it is not solely a matter of size and form. It is an acknowledgement that both worlds might share deeper connections, two paths that started together but diverged into vastly different outcomes. The question is whether in that fleeting moment when Venus was more like Earth, it may have contained the beginnings of a story I usually believe belongs exclusively to our planet. When scientists peer back into the distant past of our solar system, they do not see unchanging worlds. Every planet has passed through phases, altering dramatically over billions of years. Earth itself has oscillated from frozen snowball states to warm tropical climates and back. The Moon was once covered in oceans of molten rock. Mars seems to have had flowing rivers and lakes long before it became the cold desert I know today. In this context, the notion that Venus also went through a different phase is not exceptional. What renders it extraordinary is the possibility that Venus's past might have been not only habitable, but potentially more conducive to life than Earth's early environment. Modern climate models provide a means to examine these ideas. When researchers simulate Venus with thinner clouds and reduced levels of carbon dioxide, the outcomes are remarkable. The planet cools sufficiently to permit the existence of liquid water. And in some simulations, extensive shallow oceans cover vast areas of the surface. These models propose that Venus might have stayed stable and Earth-like for hundreds of millions of years after it formed. Some even extend that window to nearly 2 billion years, a duration long enough for life to not only emerge, but potentially to thrive. There is also circumstantial evidence. The European Space Agency's Venus Express mission, which orbited the planet from 2006 to 2014, collected data suggesting that Venus once possessed much more water than it does now. Today, the atmosphere is almost entirely arid with only trace amounts of water vapor. But by analyzing the ratios of hydrogen isotopes in the atmosphere, scientists discovered indications that immense quantities of water must have been lost over time, most probably into space. This reinforces the argument that oceans, or at least substantial seas, once covered portions of the planet's surface. If that depiction is accurate, Venus in its early period may not have been a hostile furnace at all. It could have been a planet of blue skies, gentle waves, and a climate surprisingly similar to Earth's. Volcanoes might have scattered its landscape just as they do on our world, shaping continents and venting gases into the air. The thick clouds that today trap so much heat might once have been more tenuous, providing light shade to the surface rather than suffocating it. For long periods of time, life would have had the opportunity to arise in conditions not so different from the ones I believe fostered the first living organisms on Earth. But there is a crucial distinction between the two worlds. Earth's early history was characterized by intense bombardment from asteroids and comets, events so cataclysmic the oceans could have vaporized multiple times before reforming. Venus, being slightly nearer to the Sun, may have evaded some of this instability. If that is the case, then life could have established itself there earlier, seeding its oceans with microbes, while Earth was still enduring violent impacts. In that scenario, Venus would not just have been habitable, it would have been ahead of Earth in the progression toward complexity. This possibility inverts the conventional story of life. I often consider Earth as the one unique place where everything aligned perfectly. But if Venus once had oceans and tranquil conditions, it might have been the first world in our vicinity to cross that threshold. The thought leads me to ponder not only the chance of life, but how far it might have advanced before the planet's climate turned against it. If I envision Venus during that possible stable era, the first image that comes to my mind is water. Oceans, shallow seas, and perhaps even coastlines extending across the planet's surface. Water is the component I always seek when searching for life, because on Earth it is the medium where chemistry transforms into biology. For life to establish itself, liquid water offers stability, a place where molecules can interact, merge, and over time become something greater. On ancient Venus, this may have been the platform on which the initial steps toward living systems occurred. The concept of oceans on Venus is not a fantasy. Climate models consistently suggest that with slightly different conditions, Venus could have supported surface water for hundreds of millions of years. Even 1 billion years of habitability is not out of the question. That is an unimaginably long period on the scale of life's evolution. On Earth, it took less than 1 billion years from the planet's formation for simple microbes to appear. If Venus had oceans during that same period, then life may have started there just as rapidly, or even sooner. The existence of oceans would have accomplished more than creating a habitat for microorganisms. Oceans regulate climate. They absorb heat and distribute energy, preventing radical fluctuations in temperature. On Venus, they might have decelerated the warming that ultimately pushed the planet into a greenhouse state, affording life a longer period of stability. Volcanic activity would have introduced nutrients into the water, just as it did on early Earth. Hydrothermal vents could have formed on the ocean floor, creating chemically rich environments filled with the ingredients necessary for the origin of life. It is not hard to imagine this ancient Venus as a world of contrasts, a surface of islands and continents encircled by warm seas, clouds drifting overhead, not yet dense enough to trap unbearable heat, volcanoes releasing plumes into the sky while tides moved along rocky shores. From a distance, it might have looked remarkably similar to how our own world appears today. If I had observed Venus in that state, I might not have been able to distinguish it from Earth at all. The stability of these oceans is crucial. Life needs time. It does not emerge instantaneously, nor does it progress quickly. On Earth, single-celled organisms were dominant for billions of years before complexity started to arise. If Venus had an earlier start, then it could have been the first planet in our solar system where life began its long ascent. The oceans would have provided the tranquility required for such advancement, a balance between solar energy and protection from catastrophic events. But oceans are not eternal. On Venus, the warming eventually became too intense. Water began to evaporate, and with more water vapor in the atmosphere, the greenhouse effect strengthened. A feedback loop was initiated. Slowly, the seas receded, and what might have once been a living planet started its transformation into the one I know today. Yet before that change, there could have been a golden age when Venus was not just habitable, but alive, with oceans teeming with possibilities that Earth had not yet attained. If oceans once covered Venus, the subsequent question is whether they contained more than just water and minerals. On Earth, life started in the sea. Simple molecules combined, energy sources were accessible, and over extended periods, chemistry evolved into biology. If Venus had similar conditions, it is plausible to imagine that the same process could have happened there. Microbial life may have emerged in those ancient Venusian waters, perhaps even earlier than on Earth. The most basic forms of life do not need much. They require water, a source of energy, and access to fundamental elements like carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and sulfur. Venus, in its early state, could have provided all of these. Volcanic activity would have added gases to the atmosphere and nutrients to the oceans. Sunlight, filtered through thinner clouds, would have offered steady energy. Hydrothermal vents on the seafloor may have created warm pockets where chemical reactions could proceed undisturbed for long stretches of time. In these locations, life could have taken root. On Earth, the earliest fossils indicate that microbes appeared more than 3.5 billion years ago. Some scientists believe life might have existed even sooner, perhaps as soon as conditions stabilized after the planet's violent formation. If Venus achieved stability before Earth did, then microbes there could have had a head start of millions or even hundreds of millions of years. This difference is significant. Evolution is slow, but time is the engine that propels it. A planet that begins life earlier has more opportunity for complexity to develop. Imagining Venus filled with microbial life is not a far-fetched idea. Even today, scientists have speculated about the potential for microbes to survive in the upper layers of its atmosphere, where temperatures are less severe. If life could endure under today's hostile conditions, how much more probable might it have been in a cooler, wetter past? The oceans, protected by clouds and fed by volcanic activity, may have been ideal laboratories for the emergence of early biology. But microbes, though small, are not inconsequential. On Earth, they transformed the planet itself through photosynthesis. Ancient microorganisms introduced oxygen into the atmosphere, reshaping the environment for subsequent life. They created mats and colonies that stabilized ecosystems. They became the basis for every stage of evolution that came after. If Venus once had its own microbial world, then it too may have started shaping its planet in ways I can only speculate about. The surface, the air, even the chemistry of the oceans could have been modified by the quiet yet powerful activity of living cells. The thought that Venus may have been alive long before Earth reminds me that life does not require a unique spark. It only needs an opportunity. With oceans in place and energy sources available, Venus might have grasped that opportunity early. What started as chemistry could have become biology. And once that transition happens, an entirely new narrative begins. Life alters its environment, adapts, and seeks stability. Over time, it learns to persist even against challenges. If Venus reached that stage, it would mean our solar system once had two living planets side by side, not one world filled with oceans and microbes, but two. And if both harbored life, the next question becomes unavoidable. Did Venus have the time and stability for that life to advance beyond the microbial stage? Could evolution have progressed further there than it did on Earth at the same time? The idea that microbes might once have inhabited Venus's oceans is already a captivating possibility. But the speculation does not stop there. If life began on Venus earlier than on Earth, it may also have had more time to progress. Evolution does not proceed at a uniform rate, but given long periods of stability, simple organisms can become complex. On Earth, it took billions of years for single-celled life to lead to multicellular organisms. Yet that process was not guaranteed. It relied on conditions remaining stable enough for a sufficient duration. If Venus provided such a window, then the possibility arises that complexity originated there before it did here. This is the speculative leap that captures my imagination. I know from Earth's history that once multicellular life appears, progress can accelerate. Organisms diversify, ecosystems become layered, and evolution starts to experiment with new forms. If Venusian oceans persisted for hundreds of millions of years, then perhaps they offered enough time for similar developments. Microscopic life could have formed colonies, specialized into different functions, and eventually created the first multicellular organisms. From that point, the step toward larger, more complex beings becomes less improbable. What makes Venus especially intriguing is the head start it may have had. Earth spent a significant portion of its early history recovering from massive impacts, losing and regaining its oceans multiple times. Venus, slightly protected by its position, may have avoided some of this turmoil. While Earth was still struggling to stabilize, Venus could have already been nurturing life in relatively calm seas. That temporal advantage might have allowed evolution to advance there while Earth was still awaiting settled conditions. Of course, complexity demands more than time. It also requires energy, and Venus may have been well provisioned. Sunlight was plentiful, filtered through thinner clouds. Volcanic activity would have supplied heat and minerals. Hydrothermal systems on the seafloor could have served as cradles of chemical diversity. These energy sources, working in concert, could have created an environment rich with opportunities for life to experiment and diversify. Imagining complex life on Venus does not necessarily mean picturing beings similar to ourselves. Evolution on another world would follow its own course, shaped by local circumstances. In Venus's oceans, life might have adopted forms unlike anything on Earth, perhaps adapted to higher levels of heat, denser air, or more intense volcanic activity. I cannot know what those organisms might have looked like, but the principle holds. Given water, energy, and time, complexity can emerge. This line of reasoning leads naturally to the most speculative possibility of all, that Venus may once have been home to civilizations. If evolution reached advanced stages before Earth did, then the jump to intelligent life, while far from certain, becomes part of the discussion. Even if it occurred only briefly before the planet's climate turned hostile, it would change my understanding of the history of life in the solar system. What I consider impossible today may simply be concealed in deep time. Venus, a planet that appears dead and hostile now, could once have been alive and evolving. If that is true, then the possibility that complexity arose there earlier than on Earth is not just science fiction. It is a question lurking in the gaps of our knowledge. If complex life did begin to emerge on Venus, it would have required more than just oceans and sunlight. Conditions on the planet would have needed to stay stable long enough for evolution to take those larger steps. On Earth, major climate shifts often created bottlenecks where species either adapted or vanished. Yet these same changes also spurred life to innovate. If Venus experienced periods of stability interrupted by smaller environmental challenges, it could have created a rhythm that fostered adaptation rather than extinction. The atmosphere of ancient Venus may have been thicker than Earth's, but not yet the crushing shroud it is today. A denser atmosphere can serve as insulation, moderating temperature swings and shielding the surface from harmful radiation. Combined with extensive cloud cover, this could have produced an environment that was stable, warm, and consistent. Such conditions may have been ideal for early ecosystems, allowing them to spread across oceans and coastal regions without the constant threat of collapse. Volcanism on Venus would also have played a crucial role. Today, the planet is covered with vast volcanic plains, evidence of a world shaped by eruptions. In the past, this activity might have been less destructive and more supportive of life. Volcanic gases could have added nutrients to the oceans, while geothermal heat created warm environments where organisms could flourish. On Earth, some of the most resilient ecosystems are found near volcanic vents, where life survives without sunlight, drawing energy directly from the planet. Venus could have offered similar havens. Another factor is the planet's rotation. Venus rotates extremely slowly compared to Earth, taking longer than a Venusian year to complete one spin on its axis. This slow rotation would have influenced weather patterns and climate in ways very different from our own world. Some models suggest that such slow movement could have produced a gentle circulation of air, reducing extreme weather and creating more uniform conditions across the planet. If that were the case, life would not have been restricted to narrow zones of habitability, but could have spread more widely. There is also the role of water in regulating carbon dioxide. On Earth, the carbon silicate cycle helps stabilize the climate over long time scales. Rainfall weathers rocks, extracting carbon dioxide from the air and storing it in the crust. If Venus once had oceans and rainfall, a similar cycle might have postponed the greenhouse effect that eventually overwhelmed the planet. This would have given life a longer window of stability, perhaps hundreds of millions of years, more than I might initially assume. Together, these conditions create a picture of a world not as alien as I imagine today. Thick but manageable clouds, warm shallow seas, volcanic islands, and a steady climate could have made Venus a comfortable cradle for life. In such an environment, organisms would have had the chance not only to survive, but to diversify, forming ecosystems of increasing complexity. The surface of the planet, now so barren and silent, may once have been vibrant, filled with interactions between species that left no fossil record behind. It is this combination of factors, water, warmth, stability, and energy, that makes the idea of complex life on Venus worth considering. While Earth's history reminds me that such progress is rare and fragile, it also shows that given the right environment, life finds a way to move forward. Venus, for a time, may have offered just such an environment. If complex life had time to develop on Venus, then the next step in speculation is to wonder whether civilizations could have appeared there. On Earth, the emergence of civilization was not immediate. For most of our history, life remained simple. Even after animals and plants spread across the land and seas, it took hundreds of millions of years before humans built cities. But the principle is straightforward. If an environment remains stable long enough, complexity can lead to intelligence, and intelligence can eventually give rise to organized societies. Venus, during its possible habitable phase, may have provided such a span of time. With oceans regulating the climate, volcanic activity supplying nutrients, and a steady source of energy from the sun, the planet could have offered ecosystems with enough richness for evolution to explore higher forms of life. The question is not whether life could have survived there, but whether it had the chance to reach a level where culture, technology, and shared knowledge began to emerge. If that leap did happen, the civilizations of Venus would have been very different from ours, shaped by conditions unique to their world. On Earth, agriculture arose in fertile river valleys where floods deposited nutrients into the soil. On Venus, if there were continents or large islands, civilizations may have developed along coastlines where resources were concentrated. Fishing and harvesting from the sea might have been central, especially if land was scarce. Instead of vast plains for farming, Venusian societies may have depended on the rhythms of the ocean and volcanic soils for survival. The dense clouds overhead would have created an unusual relationship with the sky. On Earth, astronomy was one of the first sciences because people could see the stars and track the movement of celestial bodies. On Venus, the sky would have been permanently overcast, hiding the stars from view. A civilization there might not have developed astronomy in the same way. Instead, their sense of time might have come from the cycles of tides, volcanic activity, or changes in weather patterns. The universe above would have been a mystery, unseen beyond the glowing veil of clouds. Architecture, too, would have been shaped by the planet's environment. On Earth, civilizations often built with stone or mud, using materials from rivers and quarries. On Venus, with a thicker atmosphere and constant cloud cover, construction may have focused on adaptation to humidity, heat, and geological activity. Structures might have been designed to withstand frequent tremors from volcanic shifts or to capture and store water in efficient ways. I cannot know what forms their buildings might have taken, but they would have been unlike anything I recognize today. Even communication and culture might have developed differently. Without visible stars to inspire myth, Venusian stories could have revolved around the land, the seas, and the mysterious forces of the planet itself. Volcanoes might have been revered or feared not as natural disasters, but as powerful presences shaping daily life. The very atmosphere with its constant clouds could have been seen as a protective layer or as a barrier hiding something unreachable. Speculating about civilizations on Venus is not about certainty, but about possibility. If life had enough time and if stability lasted long enough, then the rise of societies there is not an impossible thought. Just as Earth eventually gave rise to humans, Venus may once have produced beings who built, created, and lived in ways suited to their world. And if they did exist, their story ended long ago, hidden beneath the silence of a planet that today seems empty. If civilizations did arise on Venus, their survival would have depended on energy. Every society, no matter how simple or advanced, must find ways to harness and control the forces of nature. On Earth, early humans relied on fire, then farming, then rivers and winds, and eventually coal, oil, and electricity. A Venusian civilization would have faced different conditions, but the need for energy would have been just as central. The most obvious source would have been the sun. Even through the dense cloud cover, sunlight would still have reached the surface, filtered but abundant. On Earth, plants evolved to use sunlight for photosynthesis, turning energy into food. If similar processes took place on Venus, then life there might also have drawn heavily on solar energy. Civilizations may have learned to harness that power directly, perhaps through biological means first, and later through technology adapted to the constant diffused light. Volcanism would have provided another critical source of energy. Venus is one of the most volcanically active planets in the solar system, covered in vast lava plains and mountains formed by eruptions. In its more habitable past, these volcanoes would have been less extreme but still powerful. Civilizations might have tapped into geothermal energy, using the heat of the planet itself to cook, forage, or even generate power. On Earth, geothermal energy is still used in parts of the world today, and on Venus, it could have been one of the most reliable sources. The oceans themselves might also have been harnessed. If Venus had tides, even modest ones, civilizations could have learned to use the rhythm of moving water. On Earth, tides are driven by the pull of the moon. Venus does not have a large moon, but tidal forces from the sun could still have created cycles, especially in shallow seas. Over generations, people living along the coasts might have found ways to capture that motion, turning it into mechanical energy. The atmosphere, thick and dynamic, would also have been a resource. High above the surface, winds rush around the planet at incredible speeds, far faster than the rotation of the world itself. Nearer to the ground, those winds may have been calmer but still steady. Civilizations might have experimented with sails, turbines, or other devices to draw energy from the air. On Earth, windmills transformed landscapes by grinding grain and pumping water. On Venus, the principle might have been similar, adapted to the dense and heavy air. What is striking is that the environment of Venus, while hostile today, could have offered a variety of energy sources in its earlier state. Sunlight, heat from the ground, motion of the seas, and steady winds all present opportunities. Civilizations, if they existed, would have had to be inventive, finding ways to adapt their tools to these conditions. In doing so, they may have created technologies unlike anything I know. Solutions born not from Earth's environment, but from the unique challenges of their own world. Speculating about Venusian technology is not about predicting exact inventions, but about recognizing that necessity drives innovation. If life had enough time to evolve intelligence, then intelligence would have sought energy, and energy would have supported growth. From cooking food to building communities, from crafting tools to powering cities, a Venusian civilization would have relied on these natural forces just as I have relied on ours. The geography of Venus would have played a central role in shaping any civilizations that may have developed there. On Earth, the arrangement of continents and oceans influenced everything from climate to culture. River valleys nurtured agriculture, mountains offered protection, and coastlines encouraged trade. On Venus, the land masses were different, but they too would have guided the paths of life and society. Radar mapping has revealed that Venus has vast volcanic plains, highland regions, and large elevated plateaus. These formations suggest that the surface was once geologically active on a massive scale. In a more temperate past, the plains may have been shallow seas, while the highlands rose as islands or continents. Civilizations might have clustered around these areas where land met water, using the fertile volcanic soils and easy access to the sea. Just as the Nile or Mesopotamia provided cradles for Earth's cultures, Venus may have had its own centers of growth tied to its geography. The distribution of land and water would also have shaped climate. On Earth, large continents create deserts and seasonal changes, while oceans moderate temperatures. On Venus, with fewer or smaller land masses, the climate may have been more uniform. Civilizations might not have experienced the same dramatic seasonal cycles that shaped life on Earth. Instead, they could have lived in relatively steady conditions, adapting their societies to a world where change came slowly over geological time, rather than from year to year. Volcanoes would have been both a blessing and a threat. They enriched soils, making them fertile, but they also carried the risk of eruptions. Civilizations near volcanic regions might have depended on them for resources, while also learning to live with their dangers. Myths, rituals, and cultural practices may have grown around these towering mountains, not unlike how ancient peoples on Earth revered volcanoes as both destructive and life-giving. The link between land and culture would have been deep and constant. The highland plateaus of Venus, such as Ishtar Terra and Aphrodite Terra, are massive features comparable to Earth's continents. If they once stood above oceans, They could have supported large populations. Valleys and ridges may have guided rivers or streams, creating natural pathways for settlement and trade. These elevated regions, surrounded by lower plains, would have offered strategic positions for societies to thrive, much as mountain strongholds did for ancient peoples on Earth. The absence of a large moon may also have influenced geography in subtle ways. On Earth, the moon stabilizes our planet's tilt, shaping our seasons. Without such a stabilizing force, Venus's axis may have shifted more unpredictably over long time scales. Civilizations there may have faced slow but profound changes in climate, forcing migration or adaptation. Geography combined with this instability could have created cycles of growth and collapse, civilizations rising on fertile lands and falling as the environment shifted. Ultimately, the land masses of Venus would have been more than just background scenery. They would have been active participants in the story of any possible civilization. Coastlines shaped trade, mountains shaped belief, and plains shaped survival. Even if no beings ever lived there, the geography of Venus stands as a reminder that worlds are not empty. They are landscapes filled with possibilities, waiting for life to interact with them. If civilizations once lived on Venus, the way they built their homes and structures would have reflected the conditions of their planet. Architecture is always a response to the environment. On Earth, people in deserts built with stone to withstand heat, while those in colder climates relied on wood and insulation. In river valleys, mud and brick shaped early cities. On Venus, with its thicker atmosphere, volcanic activity, and constant cloud cover, the materials and designs of buildings would likely have been very different from anything I know. The most abundant material on Venus has always been volcanic rock. Much of the surface is covered with lava plains, suggesting that stone was plentiful. If civilizations existed there, they might have used volcanic stone as their primary building material, shaping it into walls, foundations, and monuments. The density of the atmosphere could have reduced wind erosion, meaning structures built from heavy stone may have stood for long stretches of time. These would have been solid, enduring forms designed to last in a world shaped by geological forces. The constant cloud cover would also have influenced architecture. On Earth, buildings are designed to work with cycles of light and dark, with windows that open to the sun. On Venus, the sunlight was filtered and dimmed by thick clouds, creating a more muted world. Structures may not have needed large windows or open courtyards, since the sky offered no stars or clear light. Instead, buildings might have focused on ventilation, cooling, and water storage, adapting to the warm and humid conditions. If the planet had a more stable and mild climate than Earth, as some models suggest, then structures might not have needed heavy insulation against cold or strong protection against storms. Instead, they may have been designed for comfort and ritual, reflecting cultural values rather than survival needs. Architecture could have been more organic, blending with the volcanic landscapes and coastlines, shaped by both practicality and meaning. Water management would likely have been central. Civilizations on Earth have always depended on controlling and distributing water, from irrigation canals in Mesopotamia to aqueducts in Rome. On Venus, with its oceans and possible rivers, water would also have been essential. Structures may have included reservoirs, channels, or systems to collect and store supplies. If evaporation rates were higher due to the planet's warmth, managing water efficiently might have been a crucial task for survival. Volcanic activity may have also shaped construction in regions near active volcanoes. Structures would have needed to withstand tremors or sudden eruptions. Architecture may have included flexible foundations or elevated platforms designed to endure shifting ground. Over generations, entire styles could have grown around, living with the rhythm of the planet, creating buildings that were both practical and symbolic responses to its power. While I cannot know the exact shapes or forms of such architecture, the principle remains clear. it would have been shaped by Venus itself. On Earth, temples, cities, and monuments reflect the landscapes in which they were built. On Venus, the same would have been true. The result might have been cities of stone rising from volcanic plains, homes designed for warmth and water, and monuments built under a sky that never revealed the stars. Even without evidence, imagining Venusian architecture reminds me that civilizations are not abstract. They are always bound to the land, the climate, and the resources around them. If Venus once had societies, their buildings would still tell the story of how they lived, shaped above all by the unique world they called home. On Earth, many of our earliest sciences began with the sky. People learned to track the stars, the phases of the moon, and the rising and setting of the sun. These patterns gave us calendars, navigation systems, and the ability to measure time. They shaped culture, myth, and religion. But on Venus, if civilizations existed, the sky would have looked very different. Thick, permanent clouds would have hidden the stars from view, leaving no constellations to study, no Milky Way stretching overhead, and no moon to mark the passing of nights. A Venusian civilization would have lived under a constant veil, where time and direction could not be measured in the same way I learned on Earth. Without the stars, how would they have understood their world? They might have looked instead to the rhythms of their planet. On Earth, tides and seasons became natural clocks. On Venus, without a large moon, tides would have been weaker, but the sun itself could still have created subtle cycles in the oceans. These might have been enough for early societies to notice and to use as a guide for measuring time. Weather patterns, volcanic eruptions, or the slow shifts in atmospheric circulation could also have provided repeating signals, acting as natural calendars even in a sky that revealed nothing beyond the clouds. Navigation would have been equally transformed. On Earth, sailors crossed seas by watching the stars and using the horizon as a guide. On Venus, permanent clouds would have hidden both stars and horizons. Civilizations there may have relied on sound, currents, or even magnetic fields if they discovered ways to detect them. Over water, they might have developed an intimate knowledge of waves and wind, recognizing subtle differences that pointed to direction. On land, paths may have been marked by mountains, rivers, and volcanic features rather than distant landmarks. Their maps would have been local, built from direct observation rather than from the geometry of the heavens. This difference would have shaped culture profoundly. Without visible stars, the idea of the universe beyond the planet may never have been part of their worldview. Myths and stories might have focused inward on the forces of the ground and the cycles of the sea. Instead of gods of the sky, they may have imagined powers that lived within the volcanoes or spirits that moved with the dense winds. The clouds, always present, could have been seen as a barrier between their world and something unknown and unreachable beyond. Timekeeping itself would also have been unusual. Venus rotates extremely slowly, taking longer to complete one rotation than it does to orbit the Sun. A single day on Venus is longer than a year. For any civilization, this would have posed challenges. Day and night, as I know them, would not have existed in the same way. Instead, they may have divided time into smaller cycles based on weather or atmospheric rhythms, creating calendars that bore little resemblance to ours. Their sense of time could have been more fluid, tied to natural processes, rather than to a strict alternation of light and darkness. All of this would have made a Venusian worldview distinct from our own. Where I see the sky as a canvas for orientation and meaning, they would have seen it as a blank wall, hiding the unknown. Their science, navigation, and sense of time would have grown out of the rhythms of their planet, not from the stars above. In such a world, knowledge would have been shaped not by the cosmos, but by the constant presence of their own atmosphere and the forces beneath their feet. If civilizations ever rose on Venus, they would have needed ways to share knowledge across generations. On Earth, this took the form of language, writing, and eventually whole systems of communication that allowed ideas to spread far beyond the moment of speech. The environment of Venus, with its permanent cloud cover and hidden sky, would have shaped this process in subtle but profound ways. Without stars to inspire abstract measurements of time or space, their earliest records may have focused more on the land and the rhythms of daily survival. On Earth, many of the first written records were inventories, tallies of food, or lists of resources. A Venusian civilization might have done the same, developing symbols to track harvests from the sea, the timing of volcanic activity, or the distribution of water. Their systems of writing may have been practical before they became expressive, designed to manage life in a world that demanded careful balance with its environment. The materials they used for writing would have depended on what was available. On Earth, we carved into clay tablets, painted on papyrus, and inscribed stone monuments. On Venus, volcanic rock was abundant, and civilizations might have etched or carved into it, creating records meant to endure. If plant life existed, they may also have developed organic writing surfaces that decayed over time, leaving little chance for survival into the present. Stone inscriptions, however, could have lasted far longer, though any trace would now be buried under lava plains and reshaped by billions of years of heat. Communication might also have been influenced by the dense atmosphere. Sound travels differently in thick air. Voices may have carried farther, and musical tones could have resonated with unusual depth. If so, oral traditions might have been central, with stories, knowledge, and history shared through speech and performance. Entire cultures could have built themselves on sound, rhythm, and repetition long before writing ever emerged. Even once writing developed, oral traditions may have remained dominant, shaping the memory and identity of entire societies. Culture in such a world would have been turned inward. On Earth, the night sky inspired myths of gods and constellations, stories of creation and destiny. On Venus, the clouds would have kept the universe hidden. Their myths might have focused on the ocean, the volcanoes, and the endless sky of shifting brightness above. The unseen may have carried great significance, the belief that beyond the clouds lay something unreachable, perhaps divine. Instead of constellations, their symbols may have been tied to the cycles of the planet itself, rooted in land, water, and fire, rather than in stars. Writing and communication are always more than practical tools. They shape how civilizations think about themselves. If Venus once had societies capable of recording their world, their symbols and stories would have reflected a life lived entirely under a veil. Their view of reality would not have been cosmic, but planetary, focused not on what lay beyond, but on the immediate forces of their own environment. Though no evidence remains, it is intriguing for me to imagine libraries of stone inscriptions or oral epics told across generations, now lost beneath the surface of a planet that has erased nearly all of its past. For me, this is speculation. For them, if they existed, it would have been the foundation of memory, culture, and identity in a world hidden from the stars. If civilizations existed on Venus, their development of technology would have been shaped by conditions very different from those on Earth. On our planet, technologies grew from immediate needs: tools to hunt, methods to farm, ways to store food, and later systems to build cities and navigate seas. On Venus, the challenges of the environment would have directed technology along different paths, perhaps leading to solutions I can only imagine. The most pressing need would have been managing heat and water. Even in its more temperate past, Venus may have been warmer than Earth. Civilizations there would likely have developed techniques to keep their homes and cities cool, using architecture, airflow, or underground spaces. Structures might have been designed to capture breezes or to store water in shaded reservoirs. Over generations, this practical concern could have driven innovation in engineering, producing technologies well adapted to controlling temperature and conserving resources. Energy, too, would have been central. I know that Venus is volcanically active, with enormous lava plains spread across its surface. Harnessing geothermal energy may have been one of the first major technological achievements. By channeling heat from the ground, societies could have cooked food, forged tools, or powered early machines. In this sense, they may have reached an understanding of geothermal systems long before humans did. The constant presence of volcanic heat would have made it a natural focus for invention. The thick atmosphere, while limiting the view of the sky, may also have offered opportunities. Dense air carries sound more effectively, and it could have allowed for technologies based on acoustics, signals, instruments, or tools designed to transmit information over distance. Wind itself, always moving through the dense atmosphere, might also have been harnessed in creative ways. Just as windmills transformed parts of Earth, Venusian societies could have learned to capture energy from the steady circulation of their skies. Transportation would also have been unique. On Earth, sails and astronomy allowed people to cross oceans. On Venus, navigation could not depend on the stars. Instead, technologies may have focused on currents, landmarks, and atmospheric cues. Boats or ships might have been designed to work closely with the rhythms of the sea and wind, built for stability in warm, dense air rather than for long voyages guided by starlight. Overland, the volcanic terrain may have encouraged technologies for climbing, bridging, and crossing unstable ground. The absence of a visible sky may have meant slower progress in astronomy, but this does not mean Venusian civilizations would have been less advanced. Their focus may have been directed inward toward geology, chemistry, and the forces of their own planet. Technologies may have centered on managing resources, predicting volcanic eruptions, or harnessing energy from the land. Their science might have been more practical than theoretical, grounded in the challenges of daily survival on a world of heat, pressure, and clouds. If intelligence reached a high level on Venus, it is possible they developed technologies far beyond simple tools and buildings. But unlike Earth, where technology grew in dialogue with the stars, navigation, and exploration, Venusian innovation would have been shaped almost entirely by the hidden interior forces of the planet itself. In this way, their civilization, if it existed, would have followed a different path, familiar in its ingenuity, but alien in its focus. What I consider technology is always a reflection of the environment that produces it. On Venus, that reflection would have been unmistakably different, shaped by clouds that hid the sky and by land that constantly reminded them of the planet's power. Every civilization depends on the stability of its environment. On Earth, shifts in climate have brought challenges and collapses, from droughts that ended empires to ice ages that reshaped human history. On Venus, stability may have lasted for long stretches, but it was not permanent. At some point, the planet began to move toward a catastrophic transformation, a change so complete that it erased nearly all traces of what came before. This was the runaway greenhouse effect, a process that turned Venus from a potentially habitable world into the furnace I see today. The greenhouse effect itself is not unusual. On Earth, it is what makes our planet warm enough to support life. Certain gases in the atmosphere, such as carbon dioxide and water vapor, trap heat and prevent it from escaping into space. Without them, Earth would be a frozen, barren world. But on Venus, the balance tipped too far. As the planet warmed, more water evaporated from the oceans. Water vapor is a powerful greenhouse gas, so the more that entered the atmosphere, the hotter the planet became. This heat caused even more evaporation, creating a cycle that fed on itself. Eventually, the oceans boiled away. Once water was lost to space, the carbon cycle that might have stabilized the climate no longer worked. Carbon dioxide built up in the atmosphere, unchecked, rising to levels hundreds of times greater than Earth's. The result was a permanent blanket of heat. The surface grew hotter than any natural environment on Earth, reaching temperatures capable of melting metal. pressure rose to levels greater than those found deep in our oceans. The clouds thickened into a toxic veil of sulfuric acid. In time, Venus became the most hostile planet in our solar system, a place where life, as I know it, cannot survive. For a civilization living through this process, the change would not have been sudden. It may have unfolded over thousands or even millions of years, long enough for people to notice, but too gradual to stop. Generations would have observed the seas shrinking, the air growing heavier, the land becoming less fertile. Myths and stories may have recorded the slow retreat of water or the growing intensity of heat. What began as small changes would have accumulated until the entire world was altered beyond recognition. Survival in such a time would have been difficult. Societies may have migrated toward the last remaining sources of water, clustering around shrinking lakes and rivers. They may have tried to adapt their technologies, developing new ways to store and conserve resources. But eventually, the scale of the change would have been too great. Once the oceans were gone, no amount of adaptation could have restored what was lost. Civilizations, no matter how advanced, would have faced a future in which their planet was slipping beyond habitability. The runaway greenhouse effect did more than end a habitable Venus. It erased the possibility of recovery. Unlike Earth, where climate shifts can reverse over time, Venus crossed a threshold that locked its environment in place. What had once been a stable, life-supporting planet became a world sealed in heat and clouds, its past buried beneath billions of years of volcanic resurfacing. If civilizations did exist there, this was the catastrophe that ended them, leaving only speculation in their wake. The boiling away of Venus's oceans was not just an environmental change. It was the defining moment that transformed the planet forever. Oceans are the great stabilizers of climate. On Earth, they absorb heat, circulate energy, and provide the conditions for life to flourish. When Venus lost its oceans, it lost its ability to balance itself. From that point forward, the transformation into the world I see today was inevitable. As surface temperatures rose, evaporation accelerated. Water vapor filled the atmosphere, creating thick, heavy clouds that trapped even more heat. The sunlight that reached the surface was no longer the gentle energy that once nourished life. Instead, it became a relentless force, heating the land and driving the feedback loop faster. The air grew heavier with every passing age, pressing down with increasing weight. In the end, the oceans themselves became part of the atmosphere, no longer lying calm on the surface, but dispersed into vapor above. This process also changed the chemistry of the planet. Ultraviolet light from the sun split water molecules in the upper atmosphere, breaking them apart into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen, being light, escaped into space, while oxygen reacted with surface rocks or bonded with carbon dioxide to form new compounds. Slowly, Venus's atmosphere lost nearly all traces of its original water, leaving behind only a dry and toxic mixture. What little water remained was locked away in minerals or present only in vanishingly small amounts as vapor. The disappearance of oceans would have been devastating for any form of life. Aquatic organisms would have been the first to vanish as habitats shrank and temperatures rose beyond survival limits. Land-based ecosystems, if they existed, would have suffered next. Rivers and lakes dried up, soils cracked, and plants or their equivalents would have failed without water to sustain them. For civilizations, the collapse of oceans would have meant the loss of food sources, transportation routes, and cultural centers. Entire ways of life would have disappeared as coastlines turned to deserts. Volcanic activity, already shaping the planet, may have worsened the crisis. As oceans vanished, volcanic eruptions could no longer be tempered by the cooling effects of water. Instead, they released even more carbon dioxide into the thickening atmosphere. Lava flows covered the land, burying any trace of earlier landscapes beneath new layers of rock. What was once diverse terrain of mountains, valleys, and seas became vast plains of basalt, featureless and hostile. The resurfacing of the planet erased evidence of its earlier history, leaving almost nothing for me to study today. By the time the transformation was complete, Venus had become unrecognizable. The temperature stabilized at levels that melted lead. The pressure on the surface became equivalent to the weight of an ocean on Earth. The air, filled with carbon dioxide and sulfuric acid, was deadly to any life that might have survived the earlier changes. The planet had crossed into a new state, locked into conditions that would persist for billions of years. From a distance, Venus still shines brightly in our sky, beautiful and calm to the eye. But up close, it is a world that has endured one of the most dramatic climate shifts imaginable. If it once supported oceans, ecosystems, and perhaps civilizations, all of that vanished in the long process of boiling away, leaving only a planet of heat, clouds, and silence. For a civilization living on Venus during its transformation, the changes would not have come as a sudden disaster. Unlike an earthquake or a volcanic eruption, the runaway greenhouse effect unfolded over long time scales, generations, centuries, perhaps even millennia. To those living through it, the collapse of their world may have seemed gradual, almost imperceptible at first, until it became impossible to ignore. The earliest signs would likely have been shifts in water. Coastal communities may have noticed tides creeping higher one century, then lower the next as seas slowly receded. Rivers that once ran full may have begun to shrink. Lakes essential for drinking and farming would have dried into basins of cracked earth. At first, people may have adapted by moving closer to remaining water sources, building reservoirs, or finding new ways to store and conserve what they had. But as each generation passed, the problem would have deepened. The atmosphere would have grown heavier. Breathing may have become more difficult as air pressure increased and the composition shifted. Crops or their equivalents might have failed, unable to survive in the changing climate. Animals, too, would have suffered, leading to declines in food sources. Civilizations that once thrived along fertile coastlines may have been forced inland or upward, seeking higher ground or volcanic plateaus where life could still cling to the surface. Migration, conflict, and adaptation would have become the defining struggles of their time. Culturally, the transformation may have left deep marks. Stories and traditions could have emerged around the vanishing oceans, remembered as sacred places or realms lost to time. Volcanoes, already powerful symbols, might have become central to myth as their activity grew more noticeable in a drying world. The clouds, always present, may have taken on new meaning, perhaps as a curse, a barrier that trapped the growing heat, or as a reminder of forces beyond their control. Civilizations often turn to myth when faced with forces they cannot explain. And on Venus, the slow death of the planet itself may have been the greatest mystery of all. Some may have turned to technology in an effort to resist the changes. They might have engineered more efficient ways to capture and store water or built shelters designed to endure rising heat. They may even have attempted to redirect volcanic activity or use it to their advantage. But no matter how advanced their tools, the scale of the transformation would have exceeded their ability to control it. The boiling away of oceans was not a crisis that could be solved. It was a planetary shift, one that rendered adaptation temporary at best. In the final stages, survival would have narrowed to smaller and smaller regions. Entire civilizations may have collapsed, leaving behind fragments of culture and knowledge. Small groups might have persisted for a time, clinging to shrinking water supplies, only to vanish when those too disappeared. To the last survivors, Venus would no longer have seemed like the world their ancestors knew. It would have been a place of heat, dust, and heavy skies, where every day carried the weight of decline. The story of such a civilization, if it existed, would be one of resilience in the face of inevitability. They would have witnessed their planet change beyond recognition, struggling to adapt while knowing, perhaps dimly, that no adaptation could last forever. In the end, they would have been the witnesses to their world's death, the final voices of a planet slipping into silence. If a civilization on Venus faced the slow collapse of its environment, one question inevitably arises. Could they have tried to leave? On Earth, when resources fail or regions become uninhabitable, societies often migrate. People move to higher ground, to more fertile valleys, or across seas in search of survival. But when an entire planet is changing, migration across land is not enough. The only escape is outward, away from the dying world itself. Speculating about whether a Venusian civilization could have reached space may sound impossible, but the idea is worth considering. On Earth, humans developed flight and rocketry only in the past century, after thousands of years of building tools and machines. If Venus had a head start in evolution and civilization, its people may have had far more time to experiment, invent, and push technology forward. Necessity is often the greatest driver of innovation. Facing a planet that was slowly becoming uninhabitable, the search for a way off-world may have become not just an idea, but a survival strategy. The challenges would have been immense. Venus has higher gravity than Mars, and its thick atmosphere would have made flight both easier and harder. Lighter than aircraft could have floated in the dense atmosphere, but reaching space would have required technology capable of cutting through clouds and resisting enormous pressure. Still, civilizations with enough time might have found ways to test and adapt. They may have started with balloons or gliders, exploring the upper layers of the atmosphere where conditions were less extreme. From there, they might have developed propulsion methods suited to their environment, using resources abundant on their world. The destination most within reach would have been Earth. Just one planet away, Earth would have appeared as a nearby world, though hidden from direct view by Venus's clouds. If they had instruments or methods of detecting beyond the veil, they may have discovered that another planet existed, smaller in the sky but full of potential. Earth, during Venus's decline, was moving into its own habitable phase, with oceans forming and life beginning to flourish. For a desperate civilization, it may have seemed like salvation. The possibility of such a journey raises profound questions. If beings from Venus reached Earth, what would they have found? Early Earth was still hostile in many ways, full of volcanic activity, unstable climates, and a young biosphere. Survival would not have been easy. Yet, compared to Venus, which was losing its oceans and turning into an inferno, Earth may have been a refuge worth the risk. Perhaps small groups attempted the crossing, carrying fragments of their knowledge and culture with them. Even if escape never succeeded, the effort itself would have been significant. A civilization trying to leave its planet would have had to develop astronomy, engineering, and navigation. Even if their sky was hidden by clouds, they would have been forced to imagine a universe beyond what they could see, driven not by curiosity, but by survival. In this sense, the decline of Venus could have sparked a burst of technological ambition, the kind that arises only when existence itself is at stake. Whether or not they ever reached Earth, the idea of a civilization trying to escape Venus is a reminder of how fragile worlds can be. Faced with the loss of everything familiar, the most natural instinct is to search for a new home. For Venusian civilizations, if they existed, that search may have led their eyes outward across the clouds toward the possibility of another world waiting nearby. The possibility of escape from Venus connects naturally with a broader idea known as panspermia, the transfer of life between planets. On Earth, this concept has long been discussed in scientific circles. I know that large impacts can eject rocks into space, and some of those rocks can travel across the solar system, carrying fragments of their original world. If microbes can survive inside those rocks, then life has a way to move between planets without the need for advanced technology. In the case of Venus, if life once thrived there, it is possible that some of it reached Earth. During the early solar system, impacts were far more common than they are today. Asteroids and comets struck planets with enormous force, scattering debris across space. If Venus had oceans and living organisms, some of those impacts might have launched rocks containing microbes into orbit and eventually onto Earth. In this way, Earth's first life could in theory have begun not here, but on Venus. This idea is not entirely speculative. I already have evidence that rocks can travel between planets. Meteorites from Mars have been found on Earth, identified by their chemical signatures. If material can make the journey from Mars to Earth, it is reasonable to think that it could also travel from Venus. Even though its thick atmosphere would have made the process more difficult, still, with billions of years and countless impacts, even a small chance could become significant. If Venus seeded Earth with life, it would mean that our planet's story is not entirely our own. The origins of biology here might have been shaped by a neighboring world, one that lived and died before Earth fully began its journey. In that sense, humanity and all living things could carry a hidden legacy of Venus, a genetic inheritance from a planet that no longer sustains life. But panspermia also allows for a more speculative layer. If civilizations existed on Venus and faced extinction, they might not have relied only on chance impacts to carry life forward. They could have attempted deliberate transfer. Perhaps they understood that their planet was collapsing and tried to send seeds, spores, or even engineered organisms into space, designed to survive the journey and establish themselves on Earth. In this way, Venusian life could have guided or influenced the beginnings of biology here, leaving behind only whispers of its true origin. Even if no intentional effort occurred, the concept of panspermia makes me think differently about life in the solar system. Planets are not isolated. They exchange material, share impacts, and pass fragments of themselves back and forth over time. If life arises on one world, it may not remain confined there. It can spread, adapt, and take root elsewhere, hidden in the history of another planet. For Venus, this possibility deepens the mystery. If life truly began there, and if some of it reached Earth, then in a sense, I am already part of Venus's story. Our own existence may be the continuation of a chapter that started not here, but on a world that now lies silent under clouds of acid and heat. Throughout human history, stories have been told of beings who came from the sky. In myths and legends from many cultures, there are tales of gods, ancestors, or teachers who descended from above, bringing knowledge, tools, or laws to early societies. On Earth, these accounts are usually understood as symbolic expressions of human imagination and cultural memory. But within the context of Venus, they raise an interesting question. Could some of these traditions echo a much older history, one connected to a lost world in our solar system? If civilizations on Venus faced collapse, and if some of them attempted to escape, Earth would have been the most likely destination. To me, the sky is vast and filled with stars, but to them it would have been hidden behind clouds. Reaching Earth may have been an act of desperation, a final effort to preserve some part of their culture or species. If they succeeded in arriving here, even in small numbers, the impact on early humanity or on pre-human societies would have been profound. Encounters like these could easily have been remembered in stories passed down through generations, transformed into myths of divine visitors. Many cultures describe luminous beings or bright stars that descended from above. In Mesoamerican mythology, gods were said to come down from the heavens to shape the world. In ancient Mesopotamia, stories speak of beings who brought knowledge of agriculture, writing, and civilization itself. Even in oral traditions from distant regions, there are recurring themes of teachers or ancestors who appeared suddenly and mysteriously, offering wisdom that seemed to come from outside the natural world. These stories may reflect nothing more than human creativity. But they may also echo distant memories, fragments of encounters that I cannot fully explain. If refugees from Venus ever arrived on Earth, they would have found a planet still in its early stages. Life here may have been microbial, or only beginning to take complex forms. Perhaps their arrival coincided with later eras when early humans were emerging. Either way, they would have seemed out of place, shaped by a different world and carrying knowledge unknown to those around them. To those who witnessed them, they would not have seemed like travelers. They would have seemed like gods. Even if no physical migration occurred, the idea that life seeded from Venus could still connect to these myths. Ancient cultures often saw explanations for their origins. If life on Earth ultimately came from Venus through natural processes of panspermia, then in a way, those myths of skyborn ancestors might not be entirely wrong. Humanity's roots would lie in the heavens, not in a supernatural sense, but in a planetary history that stretched beyond Earth itself. It is important for me to recognize that myths are not evidence. They cannot be used to prove history, but they do reflect deep human intuitions about connection, origin, and descent. The persistence of stories about beings from the sky may tell me something about how I have always looked outward for meaning. Within the context of Venus, these traditions take on a new dimension, not as proof of visitors, but as reminders of how our imagination reaches toward the possibility that we are not the first chapter of civilization in this solar system. If civilizations ever existed on Venus, and if some of their people or life forms reached Earth, the question becomes whether any traces of them remain. Our planet has a long and complex history, stretching back over 4 billion years. Much of that record has been erased or altered by geological processes. Continents shift, oceans open and close, mountains rise and wear away. Even the earliest evidence of life on Earth is fragmentary, preserved only in the oldest rocks. Against this background, the survival of any direct trace of a Venusian past would be unlikely. Yet the possibility cannot be dismissed entirely. One place to look is in biology itself. If life on Earth descended from Venusian origins, the evidence would not be in monuments or artifacts, but in the genetic code of living things. All life on Earth shares the same basic structure of DNA or RNA, suggesting a common ancestor. If that ancestor began on Venus, then every organism alive today carries within it the faint memory of another world. Of course, I cannot distinguish whether that ancestor arose here or elsewhere. The code is the same, but the shared nature of life could in theory extend across planets, hidden in the very fabric of biology. Geology offers another angle. If refugees from Venus arrived during Earth's early ages, their presence may have left no durable structures. Stone buildings, tools, or artifacts would not have survived the constant recycling of Earth's crust. Over billions of years, even mountains are ground down and reformed. Yet, traces might still linger in unusual places. Ancient layers of rock, odd mineral formations, or unexplained chemical signatures might hint at influences I do not fully understand. These would be subtle clues, easy to overlook and difficult to prove. Cultural traces may also be considered. If visitors from Venus interacted with early humans or with species that came before us, their influence might survive in myth, as discussed earlier, or in unexpected similarities between distant traditions. Knowledge of farming, construction, or navigation could, in this speculative framework, be interpreted as legacies of a much older heritage. Again, these are not proofs, but they form patterns that make me wonder whether human culture has deeper roots than I often assume. There is also the question of timing. If Venus lost its habitability billions of years ago, long before Earth supported complex life, then any Venusian migrants would have arrived to a world not yet ready to support them. They may have perished quickly, leaving no trace beyond the possibility of microbes or genetic material blending into Earth's early biosphere. In this case, the legacy of Venus would not be visible on the surface of history, but would be hidden deep within the origins of life itself. The difficulty lies in separating possibility from evidence. Our planet is dynamic and erases its past efficiently. Unlike the Moon or Mars, where surfaces remain largely unchanged, Earth renews itself constantly. This makes it one of the least likely places to preserve traces of an ancient extraterrestrial presence. And yet, it also makes the mystery larger. If Venus ever left its mark here, I may never know it directly. Speculating about traces of Venus on Earth forces me to think about time differently. Civilizations rise and fall, but planets change more slowly, reshaping themselves over millions of years. In that vast scale, the survival of evidence is rare. Yet the possibility remains that hidden in the deep record of biology or in the faint echoes of culture, fragments of Venus's story may still live on within us. When I consider the idea of civilizations on Venus, one fact becomes clear. I have no physical evidence, no ruins, no artifacts, no inscriptions. Nothing has ever been found on Earth or on Venus itself that proves such a past. This absence of evidence is important, yet it does not erase the idea. For thousands of years, Venus has held a unique place in human imagination, and the persistence of the thought itself is worth exploring. The surface of Venus offers little hope for discovery. Unlike Mars, which preserves ancient riverbeds and craters, Venus has been resurfaced by volcanic activity again and again. The planet's crust appears to have been renewed within the last half-billion years, covering anything older under layers of lava. If cities or structures ever existed there, they would have been erased completely. What remains is a planet where the record of the deep past is hidden beyond reach, sealed beneath rock and heat. On Earth, too, the chances of finding physical traces from such an ancient connection are slim. The oldest rocks have been reworked by tectonic processes, and even fossils of our own earliest life are rare. Civilizations, if they had reached us from Venus, would have come so long ago that their presence would now be undetectable. Their tools would have eroded, their monuments crumbled, their knowledge absorbed or forgotten. Time itself would have erased them. Yet, despite this absence, the idea persists. Venus has been called the morning star, the evening star, the bringer of light, the goddess of love and war. Civilizations across Earth gave it names and symbols, associating it with both beauty and danger. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, Venus was tracked carefully, its rising and setting tied to calendars, rituals, and myths. Though hidden by clouds, it became one of the most significant celestial bodies in human culture. Why has Venus occupied this role? Perhaps it is because its brightness is unmistakable, always visible near dawn or dusk. Or perhaps it is because at some deep level I have always sensed its strangeness. It looks so much like Earth's twin, yet it remains veiled, unreachable, a world of mystery. In my imagination, it has always seemed more than just speculation about Venus. It is not only about the planet itself, but about what it means for my understanding of civilization. On Earth, I often think of our story as unique, a sequence of developments that could not have happened anywhere else. Agriculture, writing, technology, and cities are treated as singular achievements. But when I consider Venus, even hypothetically, that view becomes less certain. Civilization may not be a one-time event in the solar system. It could be part of a broader pattern, one that includes rises and collapses on worlds other than our own. If Venus once had life that reached intelligence, then civilizations are not as rare as I assume. They may appear whenever conditions remain stable long enough for evolution to advance. This reframes the question of uniqueness. Instead of asking why life and culture appeared on Earth, I would ask how many other places might have gone through similar cycles. Venus, with its oceans and possible habitability, could have been one of the earliest experiments, a test of whether planets could give rise to societies. Considering this possibility also changes how I view collapse. On Earth, civilizations have risen and fallen many times. Empires have disappeared, leaving only ruins. Yet I still think of global collapse as an abstract future threat. In the story of Venus, collapse is not abstract, it is planetary. A whole world may have once supported life only to lose it forever. Civilization, no matter how advanced, would not have survived the runaway changes in atmosphere and climate. If it happened there, it can happen anywhere, even here. The absence of evidence does not make the idea less valuable. In fact, the thought experiment itself forces me to step back from Earth-centered assumptions. It reminds me that our planet's history is not the only kind of history. Civilizations could exist and vanish without leaving traces I would ever find. Entire worlds could have had stories, cultures, and knowledge erased by geological processes or climate transformations. This is a sobering realization because it suggests that the silence of the universe is not proof of emptiness. It is proof of impermanence. Venus gives me a mirror for thinking about ourselves. If civilizations are fragile, then our own is fragile too. If planets can erase their past, then Earth may one day erase ours. The knowledge that nothing is guaranteed, that even whole worlds can lose their stability, helps me see our achievements in a different light. Civilization may be precious, not because it is unique, but because it is temporary. Thinking of Venus in this way does not diminish our story. Instead, it enlarges it. We become part of a cosmic pattern of rise, flourishing, and decline. Whether or not civilizations ever lived on Venus, the possibility makes me think more carefully about what it means to live on a planet that is, for now, stable and habitable. The idea is not proof, but perspective. And sometimes, perspective is as valuable as evidence. When I imagine Venus not as a distant and hostile world, but as a planet that may once have supported oceans, life, and perhaps civilizations, it forces me to look again at Earth. The two planets began as near twins. They are almost the same size, formed from the same materials, and orbit the same sun. Yet one became a place of life, while the other became a place of heat and silence. That difference reminds me how fragile habitability really is. On Earth, I often take stability for granted. Our atmosphere provides breathable air, our oceans regulate temperature, and our climate, though it changes, has remained within a range that allows life to thrive. But the example of Venus shows that such stability is not guaranteed. A planet can shift from balance to catastrophe, not in a single moment, but slowly through feedbacks that grow stronger with time. Oceans can vanish, atmospheres can thicken, and conditions can cross a point of no return. Thinking about Venus highlights how much of Earth's balance depends on delicate processes. The carbon cycle, in which carbon dioxide is absorbed by oceans and rocks, keeps our climate within habitable limits. If this cycle were disrupted, as it was on Venus, the atmosphere could trap more heat than life can endure. Venus shows me the end of that process, a world where the balance failed, leaving only a runaway greenhouse effect that no force can reverse. For me, the lesson is not about fear, but perspective. Civilization often imagines itself as permanent, but Earth itself is temporary in its stability. Our world has gone through ice ages, mass extinctions, and climate shifts. It will go through more. What Venus shows me is that even planets that begin alike can diverge completely depending on how their systems evolve. Earth is not immune to change. It is simply fortunate to be, for now, in a state where life can continue. This reflection also broadens my sense of time. Human history covers only a few thousand years, while planetary histories span billions. In that scale, civilizations are brief. If Venus once had civilizations, they may have flourished for thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, and yet their memory has been erased completely. Earth could one day do the same. Civilizations may rise and fall, leaving little more than speculation for whatever follows. And yet, this thought does not diminish our present. Instead, it makes it more meaningful. To live on a planet that is stable, to be part of a civilization that can look outward and imagine other worlds, is a rare condition in the universe. Venus shows me what can be lost, and in doing so, it helps me see what I have. The contrast between the two planets is not only a scientific puzzle, it is also a reminder of how narrow the margin for habitability can be. When I look at Venus, I see not only what it is, but what it might have been. In that mirror, I also see ourselves and the fragile balance that allows our civilization to exist at all. The story of Venus, whether it included civilizations or not, leaves me with a question that has no final answer. If a planet so much like Earth could once have been habitable, perhaps even alive with cultures and societies, and then lose everything, what does that mean for us? It is not only a question about the past, it is also a question about the future. Civilization on Earth is young compared to the age of our planet. In just a few thousand years, we have gone from small farming villages to global cities and spacecraft exploring the solar system. Yet, when I place that timeline against the billions of years that shaped Earth and Venus, it is a blink of an eye. If Venus once had civilizations, their time would also have been brief, their achievements erased by the slow transformation of their world. What feels permanent to a society can vanish in the vast scale of planetary change. Venus shows me that the habitability of a planet is fragile. Oceans can disappear. Atmospheres can turn toxic. Conditions can cross thresholds from which there is no return. If civilizations once lived there, they were not defeated by war or famine, but by the planet itself, shifting into a new state that life could not survive. That reminder is sobering because it suggests that no matter how advanced a civilization becomes, it is always tied to the stability of its environment. For us, the lesson is not to imagine doom, but to see perspective. Earth is unique, not because it cannot change, but because it has not yet crossed the threshold Venus did. We still have oceans, breathable air, and climates within the narrow range where civilization can exist. But the contrast with Venus reminds me that these conditions are not guaranteed forever. They are maintained by cycles that can shift slowly or quickly in ways that matter deeply for life. There is also a deeper possibility. If Venus once had civilizations, and if their traces are gone, then perhaps civilizations across the universe are common, but always temporary. Perhaps the silence I encounter when I look outward is not because intelligence never arises, but because it never lasts long. Worlds change, environments collapse, civilizations rise and vanish, leaving behind no evidence for others to find. In this view, impermanence is not the exception, it is the rule. Yet there is comfort in this thought as well. It suggests that I am not alone in our experience. Even if I never find proof of others, civilization may not be unique to Earth, but part of a repeating pattern across planets, solar systems, and galaxies. Each rises in its time, flourishes while conditions allow, and then fades as worlds move on. If Venus had its moment, then Earth is having its moment now. The open question remains, what will we do with it? Will our civilization endure for as long as the planet allows? Or will it vanish more quickly, undone by its own choices? I cannot know. What I can say is that the story of Venus, real or imagined, shows me that civilizations are fragile and precious, and that the window in which they exist is never infinite. When I look at Venus in the night sky, I am seeing more than a bright planet. I am seeing a mirror of possibility. Perhaps it was once alive with oceans and voices. Perhaps it was the first home of civilizations. Today it is silent. One day, Earth too will fall silent. But for now, we live in the brief and extraordinary moment between silence and silence, a moment in which civilization here continues its story. I will explore the ascent and decline of one of history's most magnificent cities. I will delve into the narrative of the Tower of Babel and examine the origins of the biblical whore of Babylon. Let's analyze this piece by piece. As usual, I encourage you to subscribe. For its region, Babylon emerged on the historical scene relatively late, near the transition between the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. Prior to that, a minor settlement had been present since the late 4th millennium BC, yet it lacked substantial importance for a considerable period. The name Babylon is the Hellenized form of the Akkadian Bab Elim, which signifies Gate of God. This Akkadian term traces its roots to an even more ancient Sumerian expression, Kadangira, which carries the same meaning. The earliest mentions of Babylon in historical documents appear during the waning years of the Akkadian state under the rule of its final monarch, Shar-Kali-Shari, who was the great-grandson of Sargon the Great. At that juncture, Babylon was merely a small town, holding no genuine political sway in Mesopotamia. Following the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the city came under the dominion of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, functioning as a provincial administrative hub managed by officials dispatched from there. Babylon possessed an exceptionally advantageous position, situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, precisely at the intersection of trade routes and irrigation channels, and on the border separating two distinct cultural and political realms, Sumer to the south and Akkad to the north. This location provided ideal circumstances for its eventual expansion. Nevertheless, for a prolonged period, Babylon remained overshadowed by the more ancient and influential city-states of Mesopotamia. Toward the end of the 21st century BC, the 3rd dynasty of Ur crumbled due to assaults from Amorite tribes from the north and Elamites from the south. In 2004 BC, the Elamite king Kindatu ransacked Ur, plunging Mesopotamia into an era of fragmentation. The city-states reclaimed their autonomy and started vying for authority over territory, waterways, and commercial pathways. Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, Nippur, and various others competed for supremacy. In this atmosphere of contention, Babylon was at last presented with an opportunity to emerge from obscurity. In 1894 BC, the Amorite chieftain Sumu Abum seized control of the city. From that moment forward, Babylon achieved political independence. While not yet strong enough to contest the dominant cities of the area, such as Larsa or Isin, it maintained its self-governance and progressively increased its strength. Its ascent was facilitated by an effective administrative structure passed down from the era of Ur's rule and by its strategically placed location. In 1792 BC, Hammurabi, the 6th monarch of the first Babylonian dynasty, took the throne. At that time, Babylon was merely one among many Amorite city-states in southern Mesopotamia. Its standing was secure, yet the city continued to be a subordinate power. Supremacy in the region was held by Larsa, which governed extensive lands stretching as far as Isin, a city that had already waned in influence. Meanwhile, in the northeast, the states of Eshnunna and Mari were dominant. To the north, Assyria was just beginning its ascent. It was within this political context that I initiated the military campaigns that would eventually elevate Babylon to the capital of the most formidable kingdom of its era. From my forerunners, I inherited a robust bureaucracy and a sound economy. In the initial phase of my rule, I focused on consolidating my power domestically. I mended irrigation networks, established order in the provinces, and restructured the tax system. These endeavors reinforced the king's authority and laid the economic groundwork for subsequent expansion. The true metamorphosis of the Babylonian kingdom commenced in the midst of my reign in 1763 BC. I vanquished Larsa, seizing it along with Uruk and other vital southern cities, thereby rendering Babylon the undisputed power in the area. I then shifted my attention to the north and east. Eshnunna, which had maintained its independence for a long time and had strong links to Elam, was subjugated in 1761 BC. Around that period, conflict erupted with the kingdom of Mari on the Middle Euphrates. Ultimately, my army took and plundered Mari, and its lands were incorporated into my kingdom. Following these triumphs, Babylon ascended to a position of dominance over southern Mesopotamia and a significant portion of the north. My dominion extended from the Persian Gulf to the Middle Euphrates, encompassing the region's primary agricultural lands and commercial hubs. I administered this expansive territory via a system of appointed governors, maintaining authority over canals, trade routes, and markets, thereby ensuring stability and directing riches to the capital. Under my leadership, Babylon developed into the political and spiritual core of the region. Marduk, the city's patron deity, was promoted to the highest position in the Sumero-Akkadian pantheon. The king of Babylon was perceived not merely as a sovereign, but as the terrestrial agent of the supreme God, enacting his divine will. Babylonian society was structured into three principal tiers. At the apex were the Awalim, free property owners who were able to protect their rights in a court of law and participate in political and civic affairs. This group consisted mainly of aristocrats, affluent landowners, traders, and the military elite. Beneath them were the Mushkenim, which translates to those who bow down, a class of landless individuals who did not possess full rights of citizenship. They typically leased land from the monarchy or the temples and were required to surrender a portion of their yield in exchange. Nevertheless, they were permitted to possess personal assets and initiate legal proceedings, albeit with certain restrictions. For example, the testimony of an Awilim was valued more highly than that of a Mushkenim, and the penalties for identical offenses were more severe for the latter. Initially composed primarily of agriculturalists, the Mushkenim class eventually grew to encompass royal administrators, artisans, merchants, and soldiers. At the lowest level of the social order were the wardom, slaves who had absolutely no rights. Individuals were enslaved as a result of being captured in war, failing to pay debts, or as a consequence of criminal acts. They could be owned by the king, a temple, or even private individuals. Slaves were denied personal property and were regarded as chattel that could be bought, sold, mortgaged, or leased. If a free individual caused harm to a slave, it was considered merely as damage to another's property, and the perpetrator was only required to provide monetary compensation. In addition to the social stratification, kinship bonds and economic functions also molded Babylonian society. The family structure was patriarchal, with the male figure serving as the head of the household, wielding almost complete control over its members. Women, particularly those from the higher echelons of society, possessed certain property rights. They were permitted to own land, act as priestesses, and even manage commercial enterprises. However, they remained formally subordinate to male authority. Priests and priestesses associated with the worship of Marduk and other deities enjoyed a distinct status. They were held in high esteem and were frequently exempt from taxes and obligations. My greatest legacy was my Code of Laws, the most renowned and well-preserved compilation of laws from ancient Mesopotamia. It was inscribed on a black diorite stele and positioned in the heart of the capital for all citizens to view the statutes governing the state. In the preamble, I assert that I was given these laws by the god Marduk to institute justice throughout the land, to eliminate the malevolent and the unjust, and to stop the powerful from exploiting the weak. This declaration underscores the divine character of royal authority and portrays the law as a manifestation of the divine will. For a considerable period, this code was believed to be the earliest in history, although I now understand that this is not accurate. The Code of Hammurabi addressed nearly every facet of existence, including commerce, agriculture, familial issues, criminal acts, judicial processes, and property disagreements. Yet the laws were not enforced uniformly. Penalties were contingent upon the social standing of both the perpetrator and the person wronged. A free individual, for instance, could face a mere fine for a transgression for which a slave might be put to death. The status of the victim was also a significant factor. The killing of a slave was regarded as a minor infraction, whereas taking the life of an Awilam was considered a grave offense. A significant number of the statutes adhered to the principle of an eye for an eye, particularly in cases where the involved parties were of the same social rank. Concurrently, the Code provided social safeguards, with provisions to protect widows, orphans, and tenant farmers, and to govern debts and labor conditions. My code established the concept of royal authority as a power superior to individual interests, intended to preserve public order. It served as an instrument of centralized governance, unifying society under a single legal framework supported by the authority of both the monarch and the divine. This legal structure formed the basis of Babylon's stability throughout my reign. Among the most powerful and persistent connotations linked with Babylon is the notion of sacred prostitution. Even in ancient times, the city was perceived as a center of opulence and indulgence. The Greek historian Herodotus, for example, asserted that every Babylonian woman was obligated, on at least one occasion in her lifetime, to offer herself to a stranger within the temple of the goddess Ishtar. Subsequently, biblical authors adopted this motif, depicting Babylon as an emblem of wickedness and depravity, which led to the enduring image of the whore of Babylon. The actual historical situation, however, is significantly more intricate. No archaeological findings suggest that structured temple prostitution was ever a practice in Babylon. What Herodotus characterized as a religious rite is now believed by the majority of academics to be either a hyperbole or a misunderstanding of local customs. Mesopotamian records do reference priestesses of Ishtar, such as the Kadishtu, women who might have participated in fertility ceremonies. Yet, determining whether these rituals included literal sexual activity is exceedingly challenging. It appears more probable that the ritualized sexuality within the cults of Ishtar and other deities was symbolic, conveyed through ceremonies, music, dance, or possibly dramatic enactments. Greek writers, however, construed these traditions from their own perspective of Eastern indulgence. In this context, sacred prostitution, as it is commonly conceived, is more a product of myth than reality, albeit a myth that has proven remarkably durable and has contributed to solidifying Babylon's notoriety as a city of vice. Following my passing in 1750 BC, the monarchy was inherited by my son, Samsu-iluna. While he received a vast empire, maintaining its unity was a much greater challenge than its initial expansion had been. Externally, Babylon appeared to retain its strength. However, during Samsu-iluna's rule, the initial signs of weakness emerged. The economy, burdened by my father's incessant military campaigns, began to falter. Southern cities such as Uruk, Isin, and Larsa quickly revolted, with Ur and Nippur offering the most vigorous resistance. Ultimately, southern Mesopotamia broke free from Babylonian authority and started moving towards autonomy. The north presented fresh challenges as well. Assyria, previously a vassal of Babylon, was consistently gaining in power. Concurrently, Kassite tribes from the Zagros Mountains started to be mentioned in documents, initially as hired soldiers, marauders, and minor irritants. Their incursions were at first infrequent, but over time they established settlements in the northeast. They constructed fortresses and started to infiltrate Babylon's governmental structure. The names of Samsu-iluna's heirs have not been preserved, and their periods of rule have left minimal historical evidence. This scarcity of records is in itself an indicator of both political and cultural decay. By the mid-17th century BC, Babylon's authority had fragmented. The kingdom's domain diminished, regional leaders governed autonomously, and the enfeebled state became vulnerable to emerging northern powers, first Eshnunna, then Mitanni, and eventually the Hittites. Around 1595 BC, the Hittite monarch Mursili I initiated an unexpected invasion of Babylonian territory. He advanced across northern Mesopotamia and launched a direct assault on Babylon. The city was conquered. The Hittites plundered it and executed the final king of the Amorite dynasty, Samsu-ditana. This was a catastrophic event for the old Babylonian kingdom. The central government disintegrated and the administrative framework collapsed. A great number of priests and aristocrats were slain, while others escaped. Cities were reduced to ruins, and the agricultural lands were laid waste. However, the Hittites did not remain. Having secured their plunder, they retreated to Anatolia, creating a political void in Mesopotamia. The Kassites moved to fill this void. Babylon lacked the strength to offer resistance, and the Kassites swiftly occupied the city. However, rather than pillaging or razing it once more, they opted to utilize its established institutions for their own objectives. This event signified the start of a new chapter in the history of Babylon. The initial decades of Kassite dominion constituted a period of transition. Pre-existing Babylonian institutions remained operational as the Kassite ruling class progressively integrated into the government. The new monarchs embraced the Akkadian language and the Babylonian faith, preserving the established governmental structure and depending on the traditional Amorite aristocracy. These decisions ensured their legitimacy for several centuries. The first rulers, Agum II and his heirs, reconstructed temples and returned the statue of Marduk to Babylon, which the Hittites had previously seized. This was a potent symbolic gesture that strengthened the sense of both continuity and divine kingship. The Kassite dynasty proved to be the most enduring in Babylonian history, persisting for over 400 years until the 12th century BC. This was an era of comparative stability and expanding global sway. Kassite kings engaged in a proactive foreign policy, fostering relationships with Egypt, the Hittites, Elam, and Assyria. Extant correspondence between Babylon and the pharaohs of Egypt's 18th dynasty reveals the monarchs addressing one another as peers, the great kings of the era. These communications indicate that Babylon was regarded as a principal power hub in the Bronze Age world. By the close of the 13th century BC, Babylon had started its decline. Assyria's power was on the ascent, and it gradually supplanted Babylon from its position of leadership. Near the end of the century, during the rule of Kashtiliash IV, the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta I delivered a critical strike, vanquishing the Kassites around 1225 BC and seizing and pillaging Babylon. A significant portion of the Babylonian aristocracy was led into captivity, and Kashtiliash himself was transported to Assur. This marked the first instance of Babylon falling to the Assyrians. Tukulti-Ninurta declared himself king and attempted to govern via appointed officials, but his authority rapidly disintegrated. A revolt erupted in Babylon, and in Assyria he was murdered in a coup, which plunged the kingdom into chaos. The Kassite dynasty was reinstated, but its power was irrevocably shattered. The conclusive strike occurred in 1155 BC when the Elamite king Shutruk-Nakhunta took Babylon, transported the statues of its deities, including Marduk, to Susa, and terminated Kassite rule permanently. Following the collapse of the Kassite dynasty and the devastation of Babylon by the Elamites, southern Mesopotamia descended into turmoil. Competing dynasties and military leaders contended for authority, while Assyria, which had become a significant empire, increasingly interfered in the matters of a debilitated Babylonia. The decisive moment arrived during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, who advanced southward in a methodical campaign of expansion. I officially placed Babylon under my dominion, permitting its kings to retain their titles, but effectively demoting them to the status of vassals. Under my heirs, Assyrian authority became even more stringent. Uprisings were suppressed, unfaithful rulers were overthrown, and governors loyal to Assur were appointed in their stead. Babylon continued to be a venerated spiritual hub, but politically it existed under perpetual Assyrian control. In 729 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III personally assumed the title of King of Babylon, thereby terminating any illusion of independence. His successors, including Sargon II and particularly Sennacherib, showed scant respect for Babylon's self-governance. In 689 BC, following another rebellion, Sennacherib assaulted the city, razed it to the ground, and redirected the Euphrates River to inundate the area in an effort to obliterate Babylon from history. This act of destruction caused profound shock throughout Mesopotamia, as Babylon was still considered one of the most hallowed centers. The severe handling of Babylon ignited turmoil even within Assyria itself. My successor, Esarhaddon, attempted to rectify the situation with a symbolic restoration of the city. I rebuilt Babylon, reinstated the worship of Marduk, and endeavored to establish a power equilibrium between Nineveh and Babylon. To preserve harmony between the empire's two primary hubs, I partitioned authority during my lifetime. My son Ashurbanipal was appointed king of Assyria, while my other son, Shamash-Shum-Ukin, was designated king of Babylon. In theory, this settlement offered the prospect of stability, but in practice, it merely planted the seeds of further discord. Shamash-Shum-Ukin, who was brought up in Babylonian customs, possessed the royal title, but wielded no actual authority. Assyria maintained control over the military, the finances, and all significant policy-making. In 652 BC, Shamash-Shum-Ukin initiated an open rebellion. He gathered support from the southern cities, secured the backing of the Chaldeans, Arabs, and Arameans, and even established alliances with Elam and Egypt. This was a courageous and desperate effort to reclaim Babylon's independence. For a number of years, intense conflict ensued, but the circumstances were consistently unfavorable for Babylon. Ashurbanipal, deployed the complete might of Assyria, besieged Babylon, and in 648 BC, I captured the city. The failure of the uprising inflicted another severe setback to Babylon's self-governance. Thereafter, I established direct control, personally selecting Babylon's kings. During the latter half of the 7th century BC, Assyria, which had for a long time held sway over the Near East, started to weaken. Decades of continuous warfare, insurrections, and internal conflicts had exhausted its power. Following the death of Ashurbanipal, the empire fragmented into rival power centers, each vying for supremacy. For Babylon, this presented an opportunity for resurgence. In 626 BC, the Chaldean leader Nabopolassar spearheaded a rebellion and expelled the Assyrian garrisons from Babylon. He was declared king, signaling the beginning of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In a brief period, he consolidated control over southern Mesopotamia, gained the allegiance of the local aristocracy, fortified his authority, and readied himself for the definitive confrontation with Assyria. The crucial element for success was his alliance with the Medes. Around 615 BC, their king Cyaxares launched an attack from the east, while Nabopolassar pressed forward from the south. In 614 BC, Assur, the ancient Assyrian capital, was conquered. Then, in 612 BC, the combined forces of Babylon and Media assaulted Nineveh. The city was completely annihilated, and the last great Assyrian monarch, Sin-Sharishkun, died in the fighting. From the remnants of the Assyrian Empire, Babylon re-emerged as the preeminent power in Mesopotamia. Nabopolassar's rule signified the city's revival as an autonomous entity and the dawn of a new age where Babylon once again ranked among the major states of the ancient Near East. Following Nabopolassar's demise in 605 BC, the throne was inherited by Nebuchadnezzar II. During my reign, the Neo-Babylonian Empire attained the zenith of its might. In my early years, I conducted campaigns throughout the Levant, subjugating one city after another and consolidating my authority. In 597 BC, I besieged Jerusalem. King Jehoiakim of Judah capitulated and was overthrown. I exiled a large portion of Judah's aristocracy, including the temple elite, military commanders, and proficient artisans, to Babylon. I installed my vassal, Zedekiah, on the throne of Judah. However, after a few years, Zedekiah formed an alliance with Egypt and sought to escape Babylonian control. My reaction was immediate. In 588 BC, I initiated a second siege of Jerusalem. The city resisted for almost 2 years, but in 586 BC, the Babylonians breached its defenses, and Jerusalem was conquered. Solomon's temple, the most sacred site in Judaism, was demolished. The royal palace was incinerated, and the city walls were razed to their very foundations. Zedekiah was apprehended while attempting to flee. His eyes were gouged out, and he was taken to Babylon in chains. The populace was exiled in an event known as the Babylonian Captivity. In addition to my military endeavors, I transformed Babylon into the most magnificent city of its era. I initiated a vast construction project of unprecedented scale. At its core was the Temple of Marduk, the Esagila. I reconstructed and enlarged this holy complex, adorning it with cedar timbers, gold, and exquisite stone. The temple served as both a spiritual and a political emblem. At the New Year festival, the monarch would ceremonially reaffirm his entitlement to rule as the chosen of Marduk. Dominating the cityscape was the Ziggurat Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Standing nearly 90 meters tall, this immense step tower was thought to be the location where Marduk himself came down to earth. Many consider Etemenanki to be the source of inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, although some suggest other possibilities, such as the Great Ziggurat of Ur. Babylon's fortifications were equally impressive. I surrounded the city with a dual ring of walls separated by a moat filled with water. The exterior wall was nearly 7 meters thick, and the principal entryway, the Ishtar Gate, was covered in deep blue glazed bricks and adorned with depictions of lions, bulls, and dragons, the sacred creatures of Marduk and Ishtar. Extending from the gate was the processional way, a path paved with stone and flanked by lion reliefs, which served as the thoroughfare for grand ceremonial processions into the city's center. I also constructed a splendid palace on the eastern side of the Euphrates. This compound comprised residential areas, a throne room, storehouses, and utility structures. According to tradition, this was the location of the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. My wife, Amytis, was a Median princess accustomed to a cool, highland environment. She struggled to endure the heat and dust of Babylon. Consequently, I commanded the construction of verdant terraced gardens, complete with fountains and plants that flourished in humid conditions. Later accounts sometimes referred to these as the Gardens of Semiramis. In truth, Semiramis was a Hellenized version of the name of the Assyrian queen Shahmuramat, who lived centuries prior and had no link to the gardens. I reigned for over 40 years. My rule represented the apex of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. I established Babylon's military supremacy and inscribed the splendor of my empire upon the very geography of the city. I was succeeded by Amel-Marduk, who governed for only 2 years before being deposed by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar, a formidable general. Neriglissar ruled until 556 BC, at which point the monarchy was transferred to his young son, Labashi-Marduk. The young king's reign was even more brief, as he was assassinated in a court intrigue. In the 6 years after my passing, Babylon witnessed the rise and fall of three monarchs, each deposed through a violent takeover. The authority of the dynasty was severely compromised, and the kingdom's stability started to deteriorate. In 556 BC, Nabonidus ascended to power, an extraordinary and still enigmatic individual. He was not of royal lineage, but was likely an administrator or general with ties to the clergy. His rule is most noted for a daring religious transformation. Nabonidus attempted to relegate the cult of Marduk to a secondary position while elevating the worship of the moon god Sin. This action infuriated the Babylonian priesthood and significantly weakened his claim to the throne, as the king's authority in Babylon was intrinsically linked to the worship of Marduk. A major cause of discontent was that Nabonidus was absent from Babylon for the majority of his reign. He departed from the capital and took up residence in Tema, an oasis in northern Arabia, where he concentrated on safeguarding trade routes and managing caravan commerce. During his time away, authority in Babylon was entrusted to his son Belshazzar, known in the Bible as Belshazzar. The monarch's prolonged absence was perceived as both a political vulnerability and a disruption of the sacred order, because he was unable to conduct the customary sacrifices to Marduk while away from the city. Concurrently, in the east, the Persian Empire was swiftly expanding under Cyrus the Great. He had previously subdued Media, Urartu, and Lydia, and was now directing his attention toward Babylon. By 539 BC, the Persian military had forded the Tigris and commenced its approach. Nabonidus attempted to organize a defense, but the Babylonian army was dispirited. The pivotal engagement occurred near the city of Opis, where Babylon's army suffered a total defeat. Babylon was not taken by force. Both Babylonian and Greek records indicate that the city capitulated without resistance. One account suggests that the Persians redirected the river and gained entry via its dry channel. Another version claims that the gates were opened by Babylonian aristocrats who were displeased with Nabonidus. Nabonidus himself was taken prisoner, while Belshazzar probably died. I, Cyrus, made my entrance into the city as a savior, refraining from harming the temples, maintaining the cult of Marduk, and demonstratively paying homage to the local deities. I declared myself king of Babylon, king of all lands, and the clergy officially acknowledged my rule. Consequently, in 539 BC, the Neo-Babylonian Empire ceased to exist. Its duration was less than 100 years, yet in that brief span it rose to be one of the most magnificent and formidable states in the ancient Near East. Babylon was established as one of the principal cities within the Achaemenid Empire, serving as one of its 5 capitals and the location of the royal treasury. Over the course of time, however, its functions started to evolve. The hub of imperial governance moved to Persepolis and Susa. Babylon preserved its affluence and cultural dynamism, but its political sway progressively diminished. It continued to occupy a significant position in the administrative system, yet it increasingly operated as a provincial center rather than the core of the empire. In 331 BC, following my victory over the Persians at Gaugamela, I, Alexander the Great, made my entry into Babylon. The city yielded without a fight. I was received as the new king of Babylon, and, much like Cyrus 2 centuries before, I made a deliberate effort to honor local customs. I commanded the restoration of the Esagila temple and initiated grand schemes for the city's reconstruction. I intended for Babylon to be the capital of my world empire. However, I resided there for only the last few months of my life, and in 323 BC I passed away in Babylon, with my grand design incomplete. Following my demise, Babylon came under the control of the Seleucids, one of the most formidable Hellenistic dynasties. Initially, Seleucus I utilized the city as his administrative hub, but he soon established a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris. This choice was a pivotal moment. Babylon's economic and governmental roles were transferred, and the city rapidly diminished in significance. For a period, the temple remained active, and the priests persisted in maintaining cuneiform records, but the region's cultural and political nucleus had already relocated. In the subsequent centuries, Babylon experienced a continuous decline. Under the Parthians, it was situated deep within the empire's territory and possessed no political influence whatsoever. Cuneiform writing gradually fell into disuse, and the ancient priestly academies ceased to exist. By the 1st century B.C., Greek and Roman authors depicted Babylon as nearly abandoned, with its temples in ruins, its canals choked with silt, and its fields overrun by weeds. By the period when the Arabs conquered Mesopotamia in the 7th century A.D., only remnants of Babylon remained. Local inhabitants salvaged bricks from the old temples for their own construction needs. The name Babylon endured, but merely as a legend, not as an inhabited city. So concluded the tale of Babylon, a city that, over a span of 2,000 years, ascended from a minor settlement to an imperial capital, only to be reclaimed by the sands of the Euphrates. Once more, if you have watched this video to its conclusion, I would be very grateful if you would like and subscribe. There is an entire team supporting this endeavor, and I genuinely enjoy seeing you accompany me on this exploration of ancient civilizations.